Well, I think we have to understand properly what happened. First of all, the issue, we tend in our media to focus on the toppling of Bashar al-Assad, which has happened, definitely. But the problem for Israel is not Bashar al-Assad. The problem for Israel was to have a large neighbor, an organized neighbor. And we have probably to understand that, to remember that during the Cold War, Israel was surrounded by Lebanon, which is not really a threat per se. It became a threat as Palestinians went there to seek refuge. But otherwise, they had large enemies. Syria is one, Jordan is another one, and Egypt, notably, another one. And remember that in 1948, those countries attacked Israel. They attacked Israel because Israel didn't respect the substance and the letter of the resolution 181 of November 1947. But nevertheless, these were enemies. And Israel has always considered that having those large enemies was part of a, let's say, permanent threat on their country. That's why they tried to to fraction these countries. The problem with Egypt and Jordan was solved because of the US influence, and the US, in fact, managed to sponsor peace agreement between Jordan and Egypt, Israel, of course, and Egypt. The thing is that these countries, especially after the 1973 war, were not keen to resume fighting. They had domestic problems, domestic issue. They tried to develop their own economy, and they had, if you look at Egypt, it's a huge country with a huge population, especially in the north, with huge social issues and all that. So they had to concentrate on other aspects than just making war with Israel. So once they recovered the Sinai, the problem was more or less solved, and you have a peace agreement. Jordan is a different issue, because here you had the king of Jordan, the father of the current, I don't know his name right now. He was married had an American wife, and relationship between the Kingdom of Jordan and the US has always been quite.
I'm not
Sorry,
mistaken. King Abdullah. King Abdullah.
King Abdullah is the current one. That was King Hussein.
That
was King Hussein at the time. And the relationship with US were always quite good. And Jordan is not a heavily armed country. It's not very much considered as a threat against Israel. So it was not an issue. But Syria has always been considered as a threat by Israel. The country is a huge country, much bigger than Israel, with a very powerful ally, which used to be the Soviet Union. And for that reason, Israel has always been extremely careful with, not careful with Syria, but also feared that Syria could become a threat. And that's the reason why the Israelis kept the Golan Heights as an occupied territory, because for them it was a key element, a key region to monitor with intelligence gathering issues on the Mount Hernon area that they just extended a few in the last week. Just extended this area, but from the heights of the Golan, they could monitor almost all Syria and the southern part of Lebanon. So for them, it was very important. And recently, the the Minister of Defense of Israel and Chief of Staff of the IDF said that if ranking the threats against Israel, they considered that the major threat to Israel was Syria, and then Iran, and the last of the list, which counted, I don't remember if it was 7 or 10 possible threats. The last one was ISIL or ISIS, depending on you see it. So for Israel, Islamists were not a threat. Syria has always been considered as a major threat, the closest, the largest, and the most organized. And for that reason, they struggled a lot to dismantle Syria. And that was, in essence, the rationale behind the Yinon plan. The Yinon plan was a plan that was drawn in the late 80s by a former colonel of the Israeli army. And that's basically a plan, an idea to balkanize Syria and to create different sub-countries with Syria. And this plan was used in the, Yinon was an advisor to Netanyahu at the time. This plan became the centerpiece of a document that was published in the late 90s. I think it was 1996 or something like that, which was entitled A Clean Break, that was proposed by a US think tank, and that took over more or less the idea of Yinon. And we could see the same plan taken by the US in 2012. You may remember, I don't know if I mentioned that in your program or in another program, but you had in August 2012, there was a document that has been leaked, and probably I can show you that document. Opla, sorry. Now I have to find it back. Sorry about that. This was a document that explained, it was produced by the DIA, and it explained a way to balkanize Syria. And, oh, where is it? No, it's here. Sorry. Here we go. Sorry, it's in French, but this document, and it was, oh, sorry for that. I have to, sorry. Sorry. I had the text in English, and because it's very telling what the US and the Israelis wanted to do in that particular region. Here it is. There we go. I don't know if you can read that, but first of all, so that's the date of the document is the 5th of August 2012, and it said very clearly, the Salafists, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Al-Qaeda in Iraq are the major forces driving the insurgency in Syria. So it's important to remember that the insurgency in Syria was not a popular insurgency. It was definitely an insurgency driven by the outside, and namely the Muslim Brotherhood was based in Turkey. The Salafists, that were people coming from, as well as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. These were people that were expelled or pushed by the Americans from Iraq into Syria. And then you have the second aspect, which is very interesting. In this paragraph, and that's the text of the actual text of the report of the DIA. If the situation unravels, there is the possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist principality in eastern Syria, in the region of Hasaka and Deir el-Zor. And this is exactly what the supporting powers, I mean, Western powers, to the opposition want, in order to isolate the Syrian regime, which is considered the strategic depth of the Shia expansion, Iraq and Iran. So meaning that it was an idea that in fact follows the pattern developed by Yenon to divide Syria into a Kurdish area in the northeast of the country, a Salafist principality, if I take the actual word used by DIA, a Salafist principality in the south part of Syria, and a Shiite part, if you want, in the northwest of the country, namely what you have today with Aleppo, Latakia, Tartus, and so on. So this was a plan, in fact, and that plan was, let's say, designed well before the uprising or the insurgency of 2012. Let me just remind you that in February 2012, the Russians, in collaboration with the Syrian government, agreed to remove or to have Bashar al-Assad removed from power peacefully. And this initiative was presented to the Western power. The initiative was supported by Marty Ahtisaari, who used to be Nobel Prize. He was recently designed as a Nobel Prize for peace. But the Western powers refused. So the problem was not Bashar al-Assad, because if Bashar al-Assad would have been removed peacefully, politically replaced, then that would have removed any reason to continue this insurgency in Syria. And the purpose of the insurgency was not to remove Bashar al-Assad. The purpose of the insurgency was to divide Syria. That's what, in fact, what has been achieved by the Turks and probably the Turks didn't want exactly that, because if you look, that's the map. Oh, sorry. I will show you. This is the map. This is the map today of Syria. So you have in yellow, you have the Kurdish area. In green, you have the area that is under control, total or partial, by the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. You have the tiny dots, red dots here in Tartus and Latakia, which are still the areas where you have the Russians. And if you go here, of course, here the map, we should be able to zoom into it. But in fact, you have in blue, you have the occupied Golan. And you have this small extension here. That's the territory that was taken over by Israel in the last week. So that's a little bit the situation. And you see that we are not very far away from what the DIA had in mind in August 2012. And this has been possible precisely because the rationale for the insurgency was the presence of Bashar al-Assad. And removing Bashar al-Assad peacefully in 2012 would have removed this opportunity. And for that reason, the Western powers refused to have him peacefully removed. And that's a very interesting point. But the key aspect here to remember or to keep from that is that what Israel wanted is a divided Syria. And now the Kurdish area is more or less under the control of the US. The green / Hayat al-Tahrir area is more or less under control of Turkey. And there is still this this Russian presence, which, by the way, apparently, I mean, the Russian would like to leave because they don't see any point to keep a force or a base or whatever structures in Syria today. But apparently, both Turkey and the Hayat al-Sham would like the Russian to stay. That's quite counterintuitive. But my view is that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is probably now an idea of developing, or let's say trying to create something in the area it has under the control to establish new administration and things like this. I don't know, but I suspect this is that. I mean, what we have seen the recent day point towards in that direction. But even though Israel supported and even trained and even armed HTS for this operation, I'm not sure HTS is, let's say, or I should formulate that differently. HTS probably think that this holy alliance with Israel will be short-lived. And the reason why they think that is that in the first days, and in fact during the HTS operation, Israel started to bomb the older position of the depot, munition depot, and armament depots and tanks and everything that belonged to the former Syrian Arab army, even though the Syrian Arab army didn't use those equipment against HTS. But I would say Israel destroyed that preventively, meaning that Israel has absolutely no trust in HTS. And probably HTS understands that and understands that it was an alliance of circumstances just for this case, but this will not be an alliance for the long term. Israel will not keep this alliance as an alliance. And as soon as Syria has been divided and all that, probably Israel will continue to step up with his presence in the southern part of Syria. And in fact, they have already started to take over some territory, to expand beyond the occupied Golan, bypassing, by the way, the neutral zone that was I wouldn't say guarded or protected, but I would say monitored. It's probably a better word, monitored by UN forces. And Israel apparently has already plan set to step up the population, the Israeli population or Israeli occupation of those occupied territories. So there are already plans to move Israeli into this area. So we see here again that any, let's say, alliance with Israel is always marked with a lot of question marks, especially for the long term. Israel will never, I underline twice, will never hold with an alliance if it's against its objective. They will not even negotiate. They will just attack their former allies. And that has always been like this in the past, and it will be so in the future. And I think everybody understands that. We have to remember that the name of the head of the Hayat al-Sham, and namely al-Jolani, this is the Arabic pronunciation of his name, Jolani. But if you pronounce it in the way it's pronounced in the region, you would say Al-Golani. And Al-Golani means that he comes from the Golan area. So how can you imagine that this guy coming from the Golan originally, that wants to develop a Syria with a whole its own territory, how long will that last until Golani will reclaim the Syrian authority on the Golan? And in fact, we had a couple of days ago, I saw a report that the new authorities of Syria sent a letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations to ask the UN and the international community to force Israel to get out of the Golan area. So we see that these alliances are extremely fluid, that Israel, and remember that a few days ago, I don't know if I mentioned that on your program, but a few weeks ago, Bezalel Smotrich said that the area until Damascus are part of Israel. So we see here that you have on one side the Syrian claiming the right to recover the authority on the Golan, and on the other hand, you have the Israeli based on religious on religious belief, because this is just based on religion. In fact, they feel that Syria, and a large part of Syria, in fact, should be part of the greater Israel. So here we see that this is almost an impossible alliance between the Hayat al-Sham and Israel. And therefore, there will be a point, I don't know when exactly, that would require a crystal ball that I don't have so far, but there will be a point in which this alliance that was possible, that made possible the invasion of Syria, this alliance is designed to break. It might hold with Turkey, because Turkey has not really ambitions towards Syria as such, even if there is probably some kind of old Ottoman, let's say, reminiscent aspect in the operation. But I think Turkey has a more immediate problem, which is the Kurds. And I have read a report recently that Erdogan has requested the departure of the PKK and the Kurds, namely, from the eastern part of Syria. So meaning that we see Turkey with a problem which is definitely related to the Kurds, and that's probably also what Erdogan wanted to discuss with Bashar al-Assad recently. You probably mentioned on your channel that on several occasions in the last years, Erdogan wanted to open a dialogue with Bashar al-Assad. And this year, that was definitely in July, and in November or October, Erdogan asked Bashar al-Assad for a meeting, and Bashar al-Assad refused because he didn't want to talk to a leader that was occupying a part of the Syrian territory. I'm not here to judge. There are probably other consideration. I have no idea. My view is that it was a mistake from Bashar al-Assad, because most probably what Erdogan wanted was not to take over Syria, but probably to coordinate action against the Kurdish occupation in the western part, or the eastern part of the country. And that was probably the purpose of Erdogan, the meeting Erdogan wanted to set. I don't know exactly, but I think that's probably what Erdogan wanted. But now the situation is so that you don't have Bashar al-Assad anymore. The concern of Erdogan will remain the Kurds, and now he has almost free open cards to attack the Kurds, even if it creates tensions with the US, because the US are in fact sponsoring this Kurdish state in eastern Syria. But I would say, or would suggest, that the main concern of Erdogan is the border area. I mean, the northern border of Syria and the southern border of Turkey. And that's probably the area that Erdogan wants to secure, and where he probably wants to have all Kurds to be expelled from. The HTS is different because they want to create a new state. We will see under which condition. What is this group still an Islamist movement with all the we tend to liken Hayat Tahrir al-Sham with ISIS, the Islamic State. I mean, it was certainly in the genesis of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, ISIS played a role, definitely. The Western powers supported the development of the ISIL in the western part of Syria. It tried to prevent the expansion of the ISIS in the Kurdish territory, but it never made any problem to the development of ISIL in the western part of Syria. And that's why basically you had Russia to step in the conflict in September 2015. And by the way, this issue was perfectly explained by John Kerry, who explained perfectly that the Western powers observed the progression of the Islamic State in the western part of Syria, but they didn't do anything because they considered that it was an opportunity to topple Bashar al-Assad. And but on the other hand, for what regards the Kurdish area, then the Western powers tried to, let's say, channel the development of the ISIL, but never really prevented it. And the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was, as I explained, I think last time, could grow with the help of the French, the Americans, the Turks, and probably the Germans in this area, this de-escalation area or de-escalation zone in Idlib under the protection of Turkey. So, but this Hayat Tahrir al-Sham wants to develop a new state. Again, we'll see how this state develops. And here, yes, we are then at this point. We don't know exactly what they want. We certainly can identify the need for the new authorities of Syria to restore the borders of Syria and probably to request the departure of Israeli forces. I'm not sure that the international community will do anything against Israel and Israeli occupation of the Golan Heights. They have never done anything in that direction. And they didn't even prevent Trump to recognize the annexation of Golan by Israel. So I think we shouldn't expect much from the international community, and that's where we are. So, in my view, we are not in a more stable situation today. I think the situation is more unstable as ever because, again, we don't know exactly what the different stakeholders want to do. We see an Israel which is defeated in the South Lebanon, we can clearly say, defeated in Gaza, despite all the destruction and all that. It's a country that has definitely lost the respect of the international community. It's a country that has lost even territories along the northern border, its northern border. So you have all the condition for Israel to find some kind of escape to the situation in which they are. It is, and therefore there is an opportunity for Israel to escalate the situation, to expand its territory, to have some kind of victory. The victory they didn't have in Gaza, that they don't have in the West Bank, that they didn't have in the southern Lebanon. They're probably seeking this victory in the Golan area. So we are in a more dangerous situation than we were, let's say, a couple of months ago. But this shows also how the two conflicts, the Ukrainian conflict on one hand and the Palestinian conflict on the other one, has radically changed the relationships and the let's say the geopolitical environment, both in the near Middle East and in the Central Europe. So that's a little bit where we are today. So
Yeah.
A lot of questions.
Yeah. Colonel, right now, when you see the way that Iranians and Russians are talking about what has happened in Syria, they both are agreeing on that the situation was not the way that they could save Bashar al-Assad. And that's why they have decided to withdraw from Syria. And do you think that this move on the part of Russians and Iranians was a strategic move or a catastrophic defeat?
No, well, the result is that for both countries, it's a loss. I mean, definitely, Iran has lost its corridor between this ground bridge, terrestrial bridge between the Iranian border to Lebanon, but in fact, it is in the same situation as it was prior to 2003, prior to the invasion of Iraq. So the break of the bridge happened in Iraq at the time. Today, it's in Syria. But definitely, it's a loss because it was very convenient to have, and I think they both build. Sorry, I mix German and English sometimes. They built a highway that link Iran to Lebanon. So that was kind of a strategic road that helped. That was kind of lifeline for Syria, for the southern part of Syria, and all that. So this was important for Iran. From the Russian side, they had with Syria, they had a very strong ally. I mean, it used to be a strong ally, but they had an ally on the Mediterranean Sea. And this ally has started to be weakened since 2011. And today, of course, they still have those two bases in Tartus and Khmeinim in the neighborhood of Latakia. And these are still strongholds of the Russians along the Mediterranean Sea. And they still have those bases so far, by the way. They lost the political ally that was Bashar Assad. But we can see that from another aspect, because at the end of the day, Syria, especially since 2011, was an ally, and Russia tried to treat Syria as an ally. But on the other hand, it was a burden at the same time. Because, I mean, today probably the situation would be a little bit different, because Syria has rejoined the Islamic community, the different fora of the Islamic community and the Arabic community. Therefore, today the situation is probably a little bit different. But for years, Syria was excluded from this area. And therefore, having Syria, being the ally of Syria, was a kind of political burden for Russia. It complicated the relationships between Russia and Saudi Arabia, or the different kingdoms that you have, UAE and Qatar and things like that. Now, by having this ally that disappeared, it's probably lighter for Russia to develop relationship with those Arab states without the burden of having this Shia state, if I can express it that way. Although at the same time, you could say that Russia could be the bridge between the Shia community and the Sunni community, if I put it in religious terms. Today, obviously, we don't have that. Today, we have a more appeased situation between the Sunni world and the Shia world. We have seen that with the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and the mood is different. Therefore, the loss of the of Syria as enemy, as an ally of Russia, has probably a more neutral effect today. So it's a loss. Factually, it's a loss, but it has probably not so much implications, or less implication that we may expect. It probably strengthened the bond or the relationship between Russia and the rest of the Arab world. So, and we have to see how the relationship with Tahrir al-Sham and Russia will develop. We know that Turkey apparently doesn't want to harm its relationship with Russia. And that's probably the reason why Turkey didn't ask Russia to remove the bases or to leave the places in Tartus and Khmeinim. So Turkey has always had a very special, let's say, behavior, but also special role in the region as the crossroads between the Eastern world, the Asian world, and the Western world, between Islam and a Christian world, between, let's say, the eastern part of the Mediterranean and the western part of the Mediterranean. This has always been a very particular place. And even in NATO, I experienced relationship with the Turks quite extensively. And I saw how the Turks were behaving also very differently from the others. I mean, most countries in NATO I mean, within NATO, as I worked 5 years within NATO, the most countries are extremely obedient towards the US. Well, Turkey is a country that always dared to raise its voice and say, no, we don't want that. This is not, and they are extremely procedural. So when the US tried to do something, you had suddenly the Turks saying, well, that's not exactly what is in this charter or in this procedure and all that. I want you to modify this. And so they were quite a very tough negotiator in the meetings with Turkey. That's where all the NATO members were. So very interesting country from that aspect, because they really dared to say no to the US. And remember that even as the US wanted to invade Iraq in 2003, you had, of course, the very brilliant opposition of France and Philippe de Villepin in the Security Council of the UN Security Council, making big declaration and all that. You had this. But you also had another country that opposed very firmly against this invasion. That was Turkey. Because Turkey understood that by invading Iraq, this would change the balance in the very fragile setting of all the tribes and nationalities and ethnicities in the region. And in fact, that's exactly what happened, because by making an Iraq that is now returned to ethnic rule somehow, and providing specific territory, autonomous territory even to the Kurds in the north of Iraq and all that, this changed a lot of relationships between the communities in this part of Northern Europe, eastern part of Turkey, and affected the inside of country, the domestic issues in Turkey itself. So Turkey has identified the problem much earlier than the Western powers did. And for that reason, the Turks have kept some kind of anger at the US, because the US came here for no reason, in fact, to disturb this fragile balance that existed in the region. And in fact, everything that happened since then is a result of this change of this fragile balance. I mean, all the terrorism we had, ISIL and everything, all that is the product of the US intervention in 2003. So that's why this intervention and all those who participate to that, in my view, should be prosecuted. Because it's not just for all the human lives that were lost, it's also because they destabilized completely the region. Because all of them, including those so-called generals, didn't anticipate, because they didn't know the real condition of the situation on the ground. They never understood it. Never. None of them. Despite brilliant declaration of generals like Petraeus and things like this, he never understood the realities on the ground. He tried to understand, but he never managed to understand. And the result of that is that everything has been disturbed, and everything, in fact, what we have witnessed in the last couple of weeks is a byproduct of the US intervention in Iraq in 2003, because that's this intervention that created Islamism And in fact, all the terrorism, Islamist terrorism we have got in Europe since then, since 2001, or yes, 2000, yeah, I'll say 2001, is the result of the US policy in the Middle East. We can say even further, because in fact, the deepest roots of Islamist terrorism can be traced back to 1991, when in fact the US maintained its occupation of the northern part of Saudi Arabia. And that's the very fundamental starting point of all the Islamist terrorists we got since then. And that's why Osama bin Laden emerged, in fact. In fact, his first action was asking the US to leave the holy territory of Saudi Arabia. And there were much discussions in the Saudi government at the time to allow the US to stay there, especially after the defeat of Iraq. They agreed to have the US forces to prepare the offensive against Iraq, because at that time, Saudi Arabia felt threatened by Iraq, which in fact was false. Iraq never threatened Saudi Arabia, but that was the perception at the time. And that's the rationale for allowing the US to prepare for the operation against Iraq. And then after the defeat of Iraq, this was the time when the Saudis asked the US to leave the country, and the US refused. And that's exactly the point where terrorism started. And in fact, it started with Islamist attacks against US forces in Saudi Arabia, in the base of Dhahran, notably. And then, because the US refused to leave the country, that in fact created an incentive for other Islamists to join the fight against the US. And that led, you had several attacks that led to the bombing of the embassies, US embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam on the 9th of August 1998. And the response to that was a heavy bombing with cruise missiles from the US against Afghanistan and against Sudan. And these two countries were not involved in any matter in all that. But that was the reply of the US. And because they assumed that those terrorists came from Afghanistan and from Sudan, because these were the two Islamist countries. But there was absolutely no evidence of that. And because of this unjust response of the US, which in fact was, and I remember because I lived in New York at that time, and at that time, Bill Clinton was involved in this famous Lewinsky affair. It was a kind of a sex scandal in the White House. And in order to, let's say, distract the media, he launched these attacks, these bombings. And this is interesting because I remember perfectly that at that time, Louis Freeh, who used to be the head of the FBI at the time, he said that those bombings were a very bad idea because this will cost a lot of terrorism and US victims in the future. And he was right, because the 9/11, the 11th of September 2001, was in fact a replica of these bombings with aircraft or airplanes or airliners used as cruise missiles against the two towers. It was a very symbolic response, but it was engineered by young engineers, by the way, because all those 20 or 19 guys, or let's say some say 20, that designed or planned this 9/11 were all engineers, and they made kind of a replica of the bombing of 1998. It was the bombing on 1988 happened just a few days after the bombing in Nairobi. That was on the 20th of August, 1998. And 3 years later, these guys made this replica, and that launched the whole global war on terror and things like this. But it's interesting to see that everything, in fact, the initial Big Bang, if you want, was in fact the behavior of the US in the Middle East, because you had people who had absolutely not the slightest understanding of the situation on the ground. And they never managed to have a real understanding of that. And I remember when I was in Afghanistan, I was talking to some people from the civil societies. So that was some journalists, Afghan journalists, and they explained me the situation about Afghanistan. And at one point they say, well, we will not pardon the British. No, they said, we can pardon the Americans for what they have done in Afghanistan, because they never understand. They are idiots and they never understand anything. But we cannot pardon the British because they know us. And that's obviously kind of a joke, but it illustrates the extremely thin understanding that the West, and especially the US, had prior to enter the Middle East. They were absolutely not familiar with the subtle type of understanding of the situation. And in fact, in my view, they should be accountable for what they have done, because it was, they managed a war without understanding anything. And they still don't, by the way. They tried to do so. And you have a lot of people, you can read on different think tanks and all that. Problem is that they don't manage. And a lot of those think tanks are very, let's say, strong ties with Israel somehow, cultural, I would say. Meaning that there's absolutely no understanding of the mentality. And you have, in fact, that replicates very much what we have seen in Israel towards the Palestinians. The Israelis never managed to understand the mindset of the Palestinians. And that's the reason why we have those conflicts that are perpetuated by this, by inconsistencies, inability to plan or to design sophisticated, or let's say adapted strategies to cope with the problem. We are absolutely incapable to adjust a strategy to fight an adversary whose logic cannot be understood. And that's the first thing to do at war, is first to understand the logic of your enemy. And we see that, and that's why I wrote this book on the art of war, the Russian art of war. And that's also why I wrote the other one on the defeating the jihadist terrorism, to explain these different logics. Because once you understand the logic, then you can elaborate a strategy. But elaborating a strategy without understanding your enemy is just the key to failure. And that's exactly what we have seen. So we have just an expansion of the problem rather than a solution of the problem. And we have probably exactly the situation that we have today in Syria. I'm not sure we are closer to a solution. Of course, when you start to demonize someone and say that Bashar al-Assad is the devil, is Hitler, and all that. But remember, Milosevic was designed as Hitler. And eventually, he became exonerated from his crimes by the international court, the CPI, the ICC, sorry, the International Criminal Court. The same with Laurent Gbagbo, who used to be the president of the Ivory Coast, and he was also designed as a Hitler and all that. And eventually, he became acquitted by the International Criminal Court, meaning that we tend to demonize people in order to allow ourselves any kind of strategy against this country. The demonizing of these people is just a way to justify what normally should be unjustifiable. And with that, we destabilize country without understanding and without knowing what's next. And that's exactly what happened in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and everything. That's why you have in Afghanistan, you still have the Taliban. So you had 20 years of war, of killings, of Western soldiers killed, Afghan people killed for nothing. Because today we are back to square one.